Hi, I'm Annie. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do bindings on projects. We're going to bind a little iCase like this. Bindings really add a professional finish to your project, and they can be done on the outside of a project, or as you see on this carry-on travel bag, to cover the raw edges on the inside of the project. Either way, I think that a beautiful binding gives a project a real Cadillac finish. And the secret to making beautiful bindings is using a stiletto. So we're going to use ByAnnie's stiletto and pressing tool to attach bindings. Join me at the sewing machine. In this lesson, we're going to talk about binding edges on projects that have rounded corners. The secret to making a beautiful binding on a project with rounded corners is that you have to use a bias binding. A straight grain binding doesn't have enough stretch and give to nicely go around corners, whereas a bias binding is going to compress and stretch as needed to make a corner look really beautiful. There's one little complication, I'd say, to this project, and that is that when I sew bindings on, I usually sew them starting on the back or the reverse side, so that when I bring it around and stitch it on the front, my front is going to look the nicest, because I always like to do my bindings completely by machine. This is a little bit different from bindings that you're probably used to doing on quilts, because on quilts we usually sew from the front, fold it around to the back, and hand stitch it down so that it looks the best on the front, because we're hand stitching. But when you're machine stitching, you want to do that in reverse. So start on the back, turn to the front. But the problem on this little project is that what's the front here is the back at the bottom. Because if you look at this, if I start sewing my binding on here, when I get to here, I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to be sewing the other side there, which is essentially the back. So what you kind of have to decide is what part's going to get the most visibility, and consider that your front. On this little project, I think the flap is what people are going to notice the most. So that's where I want my binding finish to look the best. So I'm going to start on the inside and bring it around to this side. Now, the second consideration when you're doing bias bindings is knowing where to start stitching so that you can join the ends of your binding and have a beautiful finish that's not going to be terribly noticeable. The more you do bindings and joining the ends, the better they're going to look. And so if you want to start here and have your join right here, if you're confident with that, go for it, because it's really not going to be very noticeable. But for someone who's just starting, I would recommend that your join is somewhere over here on this side, so that if it's not exactly perfect, again, it's not going to be right at the top where it's the most noticeable. So what we're going to do on starting this project is start sewing somewhere in here, leaving a tail here so that when we get ready to join our ends, it's in this long section here. We want to always pick the longest section we can so that we've got room for joining. We're going to make a strip of bias binding, and that's covered in another lesson. But again, I don't press my bindings in half. I fold them together with right sides, match the raw edges at the top, and I pin them every few inches. So I'm going to start binding this project again by sewing on the lining side of the flap, leaving a tail here where I'll be able to join my ends, and positioning this right up here. I'm going to pin that in place just so that it's together when I get ready to sew, and then we're going to move to the machine and start sewing. Join me there. Okay, we're ready to attach our bias binding. Again, we're going to leave a tail on the side so that we can join our ends, but we're going to start sewing close to the edge so that we've got plenty of room in there to join. My stiletto is going to make this really helpful for holding things in place, and you're going to notice that I have not pinned my binding to my project. I've put a little pin here just to remind me that this is where I want to start, but I don't pin my binding in place. The reason for this is that I found that as I sew with bias binding, I stretch it a slight amount as I sew. And if I've got it pinned in place, it's hard to know how much of that stretch is going to be there. And a lot of times I end up with more binding than I want because I'm not working that little stretch in. So I just let it hang loose, let it sit in my lap, and I pull it a little bit and stitch as I go. This again is where the stiletto is especially helpful because I can help that hold while I'm pulling this away here. So I'm going to make sure that my needle down is engaged on my machine, and I'm just going to start sewing. And what I want to make sure is that my binding is following the very edge of my project. Now we're starting right out at a curve, so we're getting into the good stuff right at the beginning. So notice how I'm using my stiletto to kind of bring my fabric down even with those rounded edges of my bag. And then I'm going to put my fingers in here and kind of flatten that. I want this to be as flat as possible when my needle goes over it so that I'm not sewing any puckers in that binding. So again, I'm just using my fingers to work that out and my stiletto to hold that in place. And notice how I worked out all those little puckers and got a nice straight piece. I'm going to start sewing here. And I don't go fast when I'm going around corners. This isn't a race. Take your time and be careful. We're going to smooth this out, and we're just going to gently adjust it to match and sew around our corner. I do like to remove pins as I go, but sometimes if there's too much going on, I don't worry too much about sewing over them either. So we're stitching all the way around, and we're trying to get as accurate a 1/4 inch seam as possible. Now sometimes this is a kind of small project, it's not too much to maneuver, but sometimes if you're working on a big bag or something like that, you've got a lot that you're trying to hang on and a lot that you're trying to pay attention to. My recommendation is get your binding stitched on so that it's even with the edges. Don't worry too much about your stitch width here, so long as you're stitching a 1/4 inch or less. If you go narrower, you can always go back and refine your seam. It's hard if you go bigger because then you've got to pull it out. So if you're having a hard time hanging on to everything and you can't keep your 1/4 inch seam exactly accurate, go smaller. But I'm going to try my best to get this accurate as I go. So again, I'm keeping my foot even with the edge of that, and I'm just stitching all the way along the edge. Get to the last corner, I'm going to stitch just a little bit around that corner because I want to leave as much room as possible for joining my ends. All right, we've sewn our binding in place and now it's time to join the ends, and we want this to be as unobtrusive as possible. So here are some tricks. First of all, take the piece that's the long one where you just finished sewing and stretch it just a little bit so I call it hospital bed taut, and align it with the edges and pin it in place. Then take the first tail where we first started sewing and lay it on top of that. And what our goal is here is to sew these together along this point with a 1/4 inch seam so that when that's all sewn together, it lays really nice and flat. So what we need to do is mark where this one intersects with the one below. The best way that I have found to do that, and there are lots and lots of techniques, this is the method that works good for me, so this is the one I'm going to show you because I understand it really well. But the best thing is to lay those together, and then I'm going to mark where the point of this intersects with the point of that, and the point on the other end where it's cut on the bias intersects with the other part of the strip. Now, this is something really important to pay attention to. This strip has an upside and an underside. This one has an upside and an underside. So top and bottom, top and bottom. So we want to mark where the top strip intersects with the top strip on here, and where the bottom strip intersects with the bottom of this strip. So that's something important to pay attention to. I like to mark these with a nice sharp pin, one that's straight, and the silk glass head pins work really well because they're really fine and they don't distort the fabric. So I'm just going to find the point where the tip of this aligns with that, and I'm going to put a pin in there to mark it. And I go just through that single layer of fabric and bring it down. Then I'm going to fold this back a little bit and find the point where the other end of the strip, which is on the bottom, aligns with the bottom of the first strip. So right there is the point. I'm just going to come back here. I'm going to take that point and stick that pin in. Once that pin's in there, and I pin it pretty good so it's not going to accidentally come out, I can move this out of the way. I can unpin this and move this out of the way, and then I'm going to cut that strip. Now, if I would cut right from that point to that point, my strips would match exactly at the end, but I would have no space for a seam allowance. So I've got to add a seam allowance in there. I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam, and I'm putting all the seam allowance on this strip because that one's already cut. So I'm going to make sure that I add a 1/2 inch wider to this. So a 1/4 inch plus a 1/4 inch equals a 1/2 inch. By adding a 1/2 inch more to this, I've got enough for my seam allowance. I have some wonderful little triangle rulers that are made by Omnigrid, and I love using these for this purpose because they're not big and bulky. They don't get in the way, and I can mark my lines really easily. So I'm going to take the Omnigrid that has the long lines marked every 1/4 inch, and I'm going to align the 1/2 inch mark right so that it's right on top of my 2 pins. So if you look here, you're going to see the pin is right there with the 1/2 inch mark, and on this side the pin is right there with the 1/2 inch mark. Then I'm going to take my other triangle ruler and line it up so that it's butted up against that, and I want this side to make sure that that makes a nice straight line so that I know I'm getting it even. So if I move the first ruler out of the way and cut along here, I'm going to be adding a 2 1/4 inch seam allowances, a 1/2 inch. Now, one other thing that I do, because I know that bias stretches and I don't want this to be loose in there, I don't want to be sewing puckers, I actually, after I have that measured, scoot that up maybe 1/8 of an inch or so that I'm making it just a little bit less than a 1/2 inch bigger. Then take your pins out because you don't want to accidentally hit those pins with your rotary cutter, and you're going to cut this. And this is not a good angle to cut at. I'm going to slide this just a little bit so that I'm not worried about cutting myself, and I'm going to trim that. So I'm going to cut that right along the edge of my ruler, and I've got my binding ready to join. Now you're going to look at this, and I have to admit I gulp every time because I look at that and it doesn't look like it's quite enough, but it always works out if you're careful when you measure your pins and align your rulers. So now what you're going to do is bring these 2 strips together. You're going to allow your little dog ear on the end, and I put a lot of pins in here because it's kind of working against itself and pulling away, and it doesn't want to stay there very well. So the more pins, the easier it is when I get it to my sewing machine. Pin that, and I'm going to pin it every inch or so all the way across. Then we'll take that to our machine, we'll sew that with a 1/4 inch seam, and we'll have a beautiful join to our binding. And we're ready to join the ends of our binding and finish sewing the binding on. So we've pinned this a whole lot, and that's good because we've got all of this pulling against each other. It's not wanting to stay together real well. The secret is to just fold it in half so that you can get this over here just as flat as possible. And again, to use your stiletto to help you line things up and hold them in place. We're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam on here. And then we're going to use our pressing tool to press that seam open so that we don't have to go to the ironing board. This actually would be a really difficult seam to press open at the ironing board because it would be hard to get that down on your board. So sometimes I use the pointed end to help me get it open. This is just a little bit of a trick because you've got all these angles in here, but we're going to press our seam open as nice as we can. We've got our seam pressed open, and then we're going to bring those edges back together. And a lot of times here I will stick a little wonder clip on to hold that in place just to keep those edges together. I'm pretty much dictated where this has to go, so I'm okay with pinning it in place because that's where it's got to fit. And then I finish my seam to attach that binding, and then we'll be ready to sew it around to the other side. Again, I want to sew a nice accurate 1/4 inch seam. If possible, if not, err on the side of smaller. Notice how nice and smooth that all fit together. I don't have any lumps and bumps, and because my join is on the bias, my seam allowance is distributed over there, and I'm not going to have a big bump on the side. Now comes the moment of truth, and now it's time to fold this binding around to the other side and see how well we did. So far it's looking pretty good. Looks nice on this side. What I usually do before I start stitching down is I just work my way all the way around the piece, and actually a lot of times I will use wonder clips here because it helps hold it in place. I'll go around, and my goal here is that my binding just barely covers this line of stitching, because when I stitch my binding down, I'm going to be stitching just inside that fold, and I would love it if that line of stitching lays right on top of that line of stitching. You know, this is sewing. It's supposed to be fun. If it's not perfect, I don't stress over it. But if I know what my goal is in the beginning, it's a lot easier to get it there and make sure that it's going to work. So far this is looking pretty good. Now when I get right here, I notice that when I fold it over, I'm pretty far along, and that actually looks like my seam allowance got a little narrower there. So before I go all the way here and finish this, I'm actually just going to put this back in my machine, and a lot of times I do it with my binding on the bottom because I can see it here. But I'm just going to go in here and do what I call refine the seam. I'm going to make sure that I have a really nice accurate 1/4 inch seam all the way across here. Notice how I'm getting just a little bit wider here, and quite a bit wider right here. That's where it seemed like it wasn't quite right. I don't want to sew with my binding on the bottom as I go around that curve because it would be too easy to put some puckers in there, but I think I'm okay just doing that on the straight section. Looks good. All right, now when I fold that over, it's going to be much more accurate along there and just barely cover that previous line of stitching. So we will work our way all the way around the strip, adjusting our seams as needed, and then we'll be ready to stitch it in place. Now, when you get to these outer corners, these actually look pretty good, but if you found, I sometimes find that the outer corner is where it's easiest to get a seam allowance that's too big. It's not cheating to just trim this away if you need to. Sometimes that's easier than unpicking everything, especially after you've already joined your ends. So if you need to trim a little bit here, go for it. And it's really, you can pull your binding quite a bit in place, so sometimes I don't even bother with that because I know I can stretch my binding to fit over that edge. Wonder clips are amazing for this because they don't distort anything and they go through lots of layers and they have a flat bottom so they don't catch on your machine. They just work so good. When you get out here, sometimes you kind of have to stretch that binding a little bit to make it fit really good. It's looking beautiful. I've got a bunch of extra threads in here that I'm going to trim. Or push under. Sometimes it's hard to tell where they end, so I just stuff them under there and get rid of them that way. Make sure you put your wonder clips on with the flat part on the bottom. Okay, we've got it all clipped in place and we're ready to stitch this down. Again, I don't want to start stitching right where it's going to be most visible, so I'll probably start back here somewhere where it's not going to show quite so much. I'm just going to slide my project under my needle. I want to stitch about 1/8 of an inch inside that fold all the way down. Make sure your zipper pull is pulled to the inside so you don't accidentally hit it with your needle, and we are good to go. Again, make sure your needle down is engaged. Notice how I'm using my stiletto to look where that line of stitching is and pull my fabric so it's covering it. I'm using my stiletto to pull my fabric over a little bit. It doesn't really want to go there on its own, but using this helps me get it right where it needs to be. And I usually just stitch 1/2 inch or so on top of my previous line of stitching so that I know it's going to stay there really nice. Clip my threads off and let's take a look to see how well we did. We've got our binding here, looking really nice and even, but I think it looks beautiful. Looks nice on the back. We've got our pocket ready to close, and we've got a beautiful little case to carry our iPad mini or our Kindle. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed seeing how I use ByAnnie's Stiletto and pressing tool. I'd love to hear about how you use it too, so please share your ideas on our Facebook page, through Instagram, or even by sending us an email. Thanks so much. I'll look forward to seeing you again. Don't forget to watch our other video tutorials as well.